There were many things people feared inside Ironhold Citadel. They feared the winter winds that scraped across the stone battlements like sharpened nails. They feared the councils that whispered in locked chambers and smiled in public while weighing lives like coin. They feared hunger, punishment, and the invisible line that separated the powerful from those born only to serve. But above all of it, above every rumor, every law, every silent terror that governed life in the fortress, there was one fear that towered over the rest. They feared the king in the western wing. Kalin Voss, the Alpha King of Ironhold, had once been described in songs as a man forged for conquest. He had been broad-shouldered, iron-willed, impossible to intimidate. Men followed him because he was strong. Enemies feared him because he was relentless. Women, once, had spoken of him in hushed tones with the dangerous fascination reserved for storms and kings. That had been before the wolf took too much of him. For 11 months, the beast inside Kalin had not merely stirred. It had ruled. No one spoke of it openly, at least not where walls could carry sound. Officially, the king was recovering from an affliction of spirit and blood. Officially, the western wing had been sealed for his safety and that of others. Officially, the servants rotated under strict orders, the guards doubled their watch, and all movements around his chambers were carefully controlled. But the truth had spread, the way truth always spreads, in places built on secrecy. Through frightened eyes, broken objects, bloodless faces, and silence where there should have been speech. Women who were brought near him did not leave unchanged. Some fled half-mad from the force of his presence. Some collapsed from the overwhelming pressure of an alpha command so violent it seemed to crush the air itself. Some survived in body, but not in spirit. Others were not spoken of again. The Citadel had long ago stopped calling these incidents tragedies. To call them tragedies would imply that someone still expected mercy. Instead, people lowered their eyes and said only this: no woman survives the Alpha King. It became a law without being written, a warning without needing to be spoken. The western wing of Ironhold turned into something between a prison and a shrine to fear. Doors remained barred. Guards changed posts with rigid discipline. Servants entered only when ordered, and never alone if it could be avoided. The rooms beyond those corridors were repaired again and again. Broken tables replaced, splintered doors rehung, glass swept away, bed frames reinforced only to be shattered once more during the next rage. Life continued, because life always continues around suffering if the suffering belongs to someone powerful enough. And that was the cruelest part of it. Kalin Voss was not a forgotten beast hidden in a cave. He was king. His madness was not separate from the kingdom. It sat at the center of it. Every order still bent around him. Every political calculation still began and ended with him. His condition was not a private grief. It was the axis on which Ironhold now turned. In the eastern quarter of the Citadel, far from velvet chambers and council fires, the servants lived packed into narrow corridors of stone and wood. Their mornings began before dawn. Their hands knew cold water, rough cloth, kitchen ash, laundry vats, splintered handles, endless staircases. They knew how to move without being noticed, and how to endure without complaint. In Ironhold, endurance was not admired. It was expected. Belle Thain had learned that lesson earlier than most. She had not arrived at the Citadel as someone important. No one had chosen her because she was beautiful, brilliant, gifted, or noble. She was simply useful, quiet, reliable, hardy in ways that did not show until she had already outlasted others who seemed stronger at first glance. There were women in Ironhold who survived by charm, others by cunning, and some by attaching themselves to someone with rank. Belle survived by enduring. She listened more than she spoke. She moved steadily. She did what was asked. She did not waste energy complaining about a life no one intended to soften for her. Her mother had once told her that the world rarely rewarded kindness immediately, but it always remembered cruelty. As a child, Belle had not understood that. As a servant in Ironhold, she did. She saw it in the kitchen when one overseer humiliated the wrong girl and later found herself abandoned when she needed help. She saw it in the barracks yard when guards barked orders for sport and then wondered why loyalty thinned around them. She saw it in noble visitors who treated people as furniture, then looked surprised when no one truly grieved their departures. Pain traveled in circles. So did mercy. That was the law no council ever wrote down, yet it governed lives more faithfully than any decree. Belle carried that belief quietly. Not as a sermon, not as innocence. She knew too much hardship to be naive. She simply believed that what people planted in others, fear, cruelty, tenderness, safety, did not vanish. It returned, sometimes slowly, sometimes through unexpected doors. But it returned. Perhaps that was why she had never cultivated the hard glitter many others wore in Ironhold like armor. She was cautious, yes, tired, often, worn thin by labor, certainly, but not hardened into something sharp and merciless. That gentleness, in a place like Ironhold, seemed almost useless. At first, by the time Belle's duties began bringing her toward the outer corridors of the Western Wing, she knew the rules. Everyone did. Do not linger. Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make noise. Do not look directly at the king if the door is open. Do not go alone if the captain can help it. And above all else, if the air changes, leave. The air changing was how the servants described the moments when Kalin's presence surged. Before any visible outburst, before furniture broke, before the growl that made the walls seem to tremble, there was pressure. Something primal and oppressive that entered the lungs and turned fear into instinct. Belle had never been stupid enough to test it. Still, rules do little against exhaustion. That winter had been harsher than the last. More fires to maintain, more blankets to wash, more repairs, more late-night calls from officers too eager to display their importance by ordering servants to repeat tasks already done. For 21 hours, Belle worked with almost no pause. She carried linens, fetched hot water, scrubbed stains from hallway runners, and hauled a crate of provisions that should have been assigned to 2 people. Not one. By the end of the shift, the citadel had gone soft and blurred at the edges. Her bones felt full of sand. Her hands shook when she set things down. She had learned long ago that the body sends warnings long before it gives way, but there are times when survival requires ignoring all of them. That night, survival chose otherwise. She was meant to leave a basket near the western corridor and return east immediately. She remembered the basket. She remembered the draft under the door. She remembered thinking, with the dull irrationality of extreme fatigue, that sitting for only a moment would not kill her. Then her body made the decision her mind could not. Belle slid down the wall beside the stone archway, the basket tipping softly beside her, and closed her eyes. No one should have slept there. No one sane would have chosen that place, outside the chamber of the most feared man in the citadel, where women had broken under the force of his existence alone. But Belle did not choose it in courage. She chose nothing at all. She simply had no strength left to stay awake. Beyond the door, Kalin Voss was restless. The guards posted farther down the passage, heard the movement first, the pacing, the thud of something struck, the low rumble that was not fully human. One exchanged a tense glance with the other. They were used to this. The king had not known true rest in months. He slept in fragments, violently, if at all. Even sedatives prepared by the healers did little except turn his fury slow and more dangerous. Then came something stranger. Silence. Not the brittle kind that settles before an explosion. Not the held-breath hush of people waiting for disaster. A deep silence. Heavy, unlikely, almost reverent. One guard stepped forward, then stopped. The pressure in the corridor had changed. For the first time in as long as either man could remember, the air outside the king's chamber did not feel like the edge of a drawn blade. It felt calm, not empty, not harmless, but calm in a way that did not belong there. Inside, Kalin had gone still. The wolf, which had stalked and snarled and battered itself against the limits of room and flesh, had quieted. The beast slept. When the physician was summoned in a rush of disbelief and caution, he arrived, expecting blood, wreckage, or a trap laid by hope itself. Instead, he found the king lying in a state so rare it seemed almost impossible. not unconscious from rage, not collapsed from sedation, but truly sleeping, deeply, naturally, peacefully. The physician stared, then turned toward the hall, and there, half curled against the wall, too exhausted to know she had stepped into the center of the kingdom's most dangerous mystery, slept Belle Thain. At first, no one wanted to say what they were thinking. Ironhold was not a place where dangerous conclusions were spoken lightly, yet once a thought is born in enough minds at once, silence can no longer contain it. It had been 11 months since anyone had seen Kalin rest like that. 11 months of violence, fractures, isolation, and dread. And it happened the same night. A servant girl collapsed outside his door. Coincidence was the safest explanation. But Ironhold was built by people who understood value the moment it appeared. A coincidence that can shift power rarely remains a coincidence for long. Belle woke to torchlight and the sensation of having made some terrible mistake. For one disoriented instant, she did not understand why armed men were standing over her, or why a physician looked at her as though she were a page in a forgotten prophecy suddenly made flesh. Then memory returned like cold water down the spine. The corridor, the western wing, the king's door. She scrambled awkwardly to her feet, muttering an apology before anyone had accused her of anything. No one answered immediately. That frightened her, more than shouting would have. She began, then stopped. Her throat felt raw. Did I do something wrong? The older guard, a scar across his jaw and weariness in his posture, looked at her for a long moment. That, he said at last, glancing toward the closed chamber door, is what we are trying to understand. Belle's first instinct was fear, not only because of where she was, or who slept behind that door, but because she knew too well what happened to insignificant people when they became visible to powerful systems. To be noticed in Ironhold was rarely a blessing, yet beneath that fear was another feeling she could not name. Not triumph, not pride, something quieter, as if the world had shifted while she slept. She did not know then that this single moment would pull the hidden lines of the Citadel tight around her life. She did not know the councils would whisper her name before week's end, or that noble factions would begin calculating her worth before they ever saw her face. She did not know that Kalin Voss, the man who had become a prison to himself, would soon ask for the girl from the corridor. She only knew this. A king who had caused fear for months had slept peacefully for the first time beside someone who had brought him no fear at all. And somewhere inside that impossible fact was the first movement of the law her mother had spoken of long ago. Pain, once planted, had borne bitter fruit, but perhaps tenderness, planted even by accident, could do the same. That night, no one in Ironhold slept well except the king, and by morning, the fortress had begun to understand that the greatest danger was no longer merely Kalin's rage. It was the possibility that someone had finally found a way to reach the man buried beneath it. Because if one quiet servant girl could calm what armies, healers, and laws could not, then she was no longer just a servant girl. She was a consequence. And consequences, in places built on fear, change everything. The morning after the king slept, Ironhold Citadel moved as if pretending nothing had happened. This was its oldest survival habit. When something dangerous changed, the Citadel did not immediately react in the open. It held still. It listened. It measured which way power might tilt, then adjusted itself accordingly. That was how old fortresses endured. Stone did not hurry, and neither did the people who lived long enough inside it to learn the habits of stone. But the stillness was deceptive. In kitchens, laundries, guard posts, and servant passages, eyes lingered too long on Belle Thain. Not openly, not yet. People were careful, yet even caution has a shape, and Belle could feel it gathering around her like smoke. She tried to return to routine. She folded linens. She carried water. She sorted mending baskets and refused to meet the curious glances that flicked toward her when others thought she was not looking. She told herself that one strange night did not rewrite a life. That whatever had happened outside the king's chambers would be explained by physicians, dismissed by officers, and forgotten by supper. But Ironhold did not forget useful anomalies. By midday, she was summoned. The order came not from a kitchen overseer or floor mistress, but from Captain Rorik, the Beta commander charged with security in the western sector. He was not a cruel man, which in Ironhold made him unusual enough to be remarked upon. Broad, watchful, economical with words, he had the weary patience of someone who spent half his life containing disasters caused by people above him. He rarely raised his voice, which only made it more unsettling when he appeared in the servants' quarter and asked for Belle by name. The room quieted as soon as he entered. Belle wiped her damp hands on her apron and stepped forward. "Come with me," he said. No explanation. No accusation. That, somehow, was worse. The walk through the citadel felt longer than usual. The eastern quarter gave way to colder corridors, cleaner stone, fewer voices. Belle's pulse beat hard enough to make her ears ring. She was not foolish enough to think refusal was possible, but some frightened part of her wished for the old invisibility she had once resented. At last, Rorik stopped outside a narrow chamber near the West Wing infirmary and opened the door. Inside waited the chief physician, 2 attendants, and a chair placed in the center of the room as if for questioning. "Sit," the physician said. Belle obeyed. What followed was not cruelty, but it was not kindness either. They asked what she remembered from the previous night, how close she had been to the king's door, whether she had felt pressure in the air, whether she had heard his voice, his growl, movement from within, whether she had experienced dizziness, panic, paralysis, or the compulsion to obey, whether she had ever before stood near a dominant alpha and felt unusually unaffected. At first, Belle answered simply, then cautiously, then with increasing awareness that the room had already decided her responses mattered. "No," she said, after one long pause. "I was tired. I don't know what I felt. I barely remember sitting down. You did not feel the usual suppression?" The physician pressed. "I don't know what usual feels like," she replied. That earned the faintest flicker of interest from one of the attendants. It was true. Belle had kept her distance from the western wing as much as she could. She knew fear there. Yes, the general fear everyone knew, but not the intimate violence of standing within the full force of an alpha command. She had never been close enough until now. The physician turned a page in his notes. "We are going to attempt a controlled observation." Belle's fingers tightened in her lap. "Observation?" Captain Rorik spoke then, his tone measured. "You will not be put in unnecessary danger. The king remains confined. We only need to know whether last night was chance." Chance, Belle thought, was a comforting word people used when they had not yet found a way to exploit something. Still, she nodded. They brought her no farther than the outer corridor at first. 2 guards stood nearby. The physician remained behind them. Belle was asked to stop at a marked point on the floor, much farther from the chamber than where she had collapsed the night before. Nothing happened. Then, closer, the air shifted, but not in the way she had expected. She had been braced for pain, for crushing dread, for that legendary force that broke others open. Instead, she felt something heavy and watchful pressing against the edges of the corridor, a presence immense enough to make her skin tighten, yet not sharp enough to cut. She swallowed. "Do you wish to continue?" Rorik asked. Did she? No, not truly. But refusing now would not restore her old life. Whatever road had opened beneath her feet, she was already on it. "Yes," she said. Another step. From behind the closed door came movement. Slow, then stillness. The physician raised a hand for silence. Belle stood with her palms damp and her heartbeat fluttering high in her chest. She should have felt hunted. She should have wanted to flee. Yet beneath the fear was something else, something she would never have admitted aloud because it sounded absurd even within her own thoughts. Sadness. The room beyond that door did not feel like a throne room. It felt like a wound. A low sound came from inside, not a snarl, not a command, but a rough exhale, as if some great creature had paused in the middle of pain. The physician stared at the door. "Again," he whispered, almost to himself. This time, when they repeated the test, the result was impossible to ignore. The pressure that usually escalated in response to proximity did not spike. It settled. It changed shape around Belle's presence, as if some violent internal current had met resistance not through force, but through quiet. By the end of the observation, everyone in that corridor knew the word they were not supposed to say yet. Compatible. Not fully understood. Not officially declared, but present in every look. Belle left the infirmary with her life altered by a fact she had not chosen. In another story, such a discovery might have felt like elevation. In Ironhold, it felt like exposure. For the next few days, she was reassigned without explanation. Her work no longer kept her deep in the eastern quarter. Instead, she delivered items to the outer west wing. Fresh water, folded blankets, replacement linen, trays left outside secured doors. Never inside the king's chamber. Never alone at first, but closer than any sensible servant would have wished. No one told her why. No one needed to. The Citadel was testing how far the exception extended. Servants began watching her in two distinct ways, some with envy, as if proximity to the king might suddenly raise her station, others with pity, because those who understood power knew that becoming valuable did not make one safe. It only changed the reason one might be sacrificed. Belle understood that better than most. On the fourth evening, as winter light faded and the stone passages turned blue with cold, she carried a tray with a kettle of broth and left it on the outer table near the king's door. A guard stood several paces back, pretending not to observe her too closely. She set the tray down, straightened, and prepared to leave. Then, from inside the chamber, a voice spoke. "Stop." Belle froze. She had heard stories about Kalin's voice under the wolf's influence, that it could compel, break, strip thought down to obedience. What reached her now was rough, low, and edged with strain but not crushing. It sounded like a man dragging language through a throat too accustomed to growls. The guard looked sharply toward her. Belle did not move. After a moment, the voice came again. "You are the one, not a question." Not entirely. Belle turned her head slightly toward the door, though she did not step closer. "I don't know what you mean, my king." Silence stretched, then a bitter sound that might once have become a laugh before something in him forgot how. "The corridor girl," he said. No one had ever called her that before, yet she understood instantly. "Yes," Belle answered. The door remained shut. She could not see him. That made the conversation feel stranger, more dangerous somehow, as if speaking through wood and iron gave both of them a kind of safety they did not trust enough to abandon. "You were afraid," he said. Belle frowned faintly. "Everyone is afraid here. That is not an answer." Something in the way he said it tightened the air, not with alpha force exactly, but with old authority held on a fraying leash. Belle hesitated. There was risk in honesty. There was also risk in lying badly. "Yes," she said at last. "I was afraid, yet you stayed." I fell asleep. This time the bitter almost laugh returned, softer than before. Of all the possible beginnings to a bond that would one day unsettle an entire kingdom, it might have been that. A king half lost to the beast, and a servant too tired to perform fear correctly. Belle should have left then. The tray had been delivered. No order had been given to remain. But something in the silence on the other side of the door felt less like threat than waiting. "You slept," Kalin said after a while. "And I did too." Belle lowered her gaze, though there was no one to meet it beyond the wood. "So they say." There was no answer for several breaths. Then, "No one rests near me." It was not pride, not warning. The words carried the hollow weight of a man forced to name the damage he caused because everyone around him was too afraid to speak it plainly. For the first time, Belle heard the suffering beneath the fear. And because she heard it, she responded not as a courtier or soldier might, but as herself. "That must be lonely," she said. The corridor went still. The guard behind her shifted. Perhaps he thought she had overstepped. Perhaps she had. On the other side of the door came no growl, no command, no violence, only silence so deep it seemed to gather around the words she had spoken and test them for mockery. Belle had not meant them as pity. She did not pity kings. Power often protected them from consequences that would have destroyed ordinary people. But Kalin's loneliness felt different, not the loneliness of distance or pride. the loneliness of becoming unbearable even to those whose duty required them to endure you. At length, his voice returned, quieter. Yes, that one word changed something neither of them could yet name. Until then, Kalin had been a terror, a political problem, a creature, a danger others managed. Even his own suffering was spoken of as a condition to be controlled, not a grief to be understood. Belle, by acknowledging his loneliness, did something no physician, guard, or council member had done in months. She treated him like a person trapped inside the monster everyone feared. This was the first real seed she planted. Not love, not trust. Recognition. And recognition has consequences. The next day, another tray was assigned to her. And the next after that, some conversations were only a few words. Some ended in silence. Once, he asked what flower had been tucked into the crack of the tray cloth. Belle said it was only dried lavender from the Eastern store, meant to keep insects away from linens. He said the scent was better than the tonics the healers sent. The following evening, without being told to, Belle tucked another sprig beside the folded napkin. A small thing. In Ironhold, small things mattered because nothing gentle ever arrived in large forms. Over the course of a week, a pattern formed. She came. She left food or blankets or mended garments outside the door. Sometimes he spoke, sometimes he did not. When he was agitated, the corridor felt harsher, but less so when she remained. When she left too quickly, the unrest often returned. The physicians measured. The guards observed. The council, no doubt, began to calculate. But for Belle, the truth was simpler and more dangerous. The more she stood in those cold hallways listening to Kalin's damaged voice through the barrier of wood and iron, the more she sensed the law of cause and effect unfolding in a way no one around them fully understood. He had lived as force. The world had answered with fear. She offered quiet. The world around him shifted. He had brought pain into every room he entered, even unwillingly. The price had been isolation so complete that even sleep abandoned him. She brought no challenge, no demand, no hunger to possess. And in return, he began, little by little, to unclench from the violence that had consumed him. This was not magic. It was consequence. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Not in a way that erased what he had done or suffered, but consequence all the same. One evening, as snow tapped softly against the narrow window slits, Kalin asked her a question she did not expect. "Why are you not cruel?" Belle blinked at the door. The question was so strange she nearly laughed. "I beg your pardon?" "You have reason enough." His voice roughened. "This place gives everyone reason." Belle looked down at her hands. Chapped knuckles. A burn scar near the wrist. Threads from other people's clothes caught against her cuff. There was no simple answer. "Because cruelty spreads," she said finally. "I have seen enough of it already. And kindness does not?" "Oh, it does." She surprised herself with the firmness in her tone. "It simply spreads more slowly." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "You believe that?" "Yes." A faint shift of movement sounded from inside. Perhaps he had risen. Perhaps he stood with one hand braced against the inner side of the door. Belle imagined him there without wanting to. Enormous, tense, half shadow, half man. "You speak," Kalin said, "as though the world is just." "No," Belle replied. "I speak as though actions return. Justice and return are not always the same thing." Silence again. Yet this silence did not feel empty. It felt like a man listening with more attention than he was accustomed to granting anyone. Belle went back to her room that night, shaken in a way she could not explain to herself. She had not been charmed by a king. She had not been conquered by danger. She had simply looked too closely into another person's ruin and found something there that answered a hidden part of her own loneliness. That was how it began. Not with a declaration. Not with desire. Not even with trust. With the slow, unsettling realization that being seen changes people, and that sometimes the smallest act of seeing becomes the first cause in a chain that alters everything after it. By the second week, Ironhold had stopped asking whether Belle was an exception. The fortress had moved on to a far more dangerous question. What would happen if the exception became necessary? And for Belle, another question, quieter and more frightening, had begun to grow beneath it. If a man has become monstrous through pain, and peace only comes when someone remains beside him without fear, then what does that someone become in return? A healer? A shield? A weakness? Or the first person whose presence begins to teach a broken king that love cannot be taken by force, only returned through what one chooses to become? The Citadel did not yet know, neither did Belle, but the law had already set itself in motion, and no one inside Ironhold would escape its cost. By the time the first month of Belle's reassignment ended, everyone in Ironhold Citadel understood that something impossible was happening, even if no one agreed on what it meant. The physicians called it a stabilizing response. The guards called it luck. The servants called it a miracle when they felt bold and a curse when they felt honest. The council called it nothing at all in public. But whatever language people chose, the pattern did not change. When Belle was near, the western wing quieted. Not always entirely. Not perfectly. Kalin still had violent days, restless nights, and stretches where the wolf surged so close to the surface that even the soldiers outside his chamber drew breath carefully. Yet compared to the previous 11 months, the difference was undeniable. Fewer shattered furnishings, fewer emergency sedations, less blood on stone, less of that sickening psychic pressure that made women tremble before they even understood why. And because Ironhold was a place that valued effects before causes, Belle's worth increased long before anyone treated her with corresponding care. That, too, followed the law she had always known. The world often notices what you can do before it notices what it is doing to you. At first, the changes were subtle. Her tasks lightened, though not from compassion. She was no longer sent to the heaviest kitchens or the freezing wash halls. Her sleeping pallet was moved from the cramped lower east corridor to a smaller chamber shared with only one other girl. She received better boots after Captain Rorik observed her limping one evening and said nothing about how quickly the quartermaster obeyed. Meals meant for ordinary servants appeared with extra bread more often than chance could explain. Others saw these changes and drew the wrong conclusions. Some thought Belle fortunate, privileged, favored by power. Few understood that in Ironhold, special treatment was often only the first stage of possession. Belle understood. Each new comfort came tied to invisible strings. She was expected to remain available, to be rested, to be near. She was monitored without being formally confined. Questions about her health became more frequent, not because anyone particularly cherished her well-being, but because her well-being now affected someone more important. Kalin Voss slept more when she came. That fact made her useful. Usefulness was not safety. Still, she could not deny that something real was changing between them. Something no physician's notes could fully explain. Their conversations at the door grew longer. Sometimes he asked about simple things no one at court would have imagined mattered to him. Whether snow had reached the eastern rooftops, what herbs were in the broth, whether the smithy still rang before sunrise, whether the birds ever nested in the old tower alcove above the servants' yard come spring. These were not kingly questions. They were the questions of a man starving for ordinary life while imprisoned inside extraordinary violence. Sometimes, Belle answered directly. Sometimes she described more than he asked, because she sensed his hunger was not really for information, but for participation in a world that had gone on without him. She told him about a cook who sang badly when he needed dough and insisted no one could hear. About a laundry girl who mended sleeves with such tiny, neat stitches that even the seamstresses praised her. About the eastern corridor window that caught the pink of dawn for exactly 3 minutes in winter before turning gray again. He listened. That was its own kind of intimacy. To be heard in Ironhold without interruption, contempt, or calculation was rare enough to feel almost illicit. Belle had gone years saying little because little was expected of her. Kalin, for all his former authority, had likely spent months being discussed, restrained, or managed rather than truly listened to. So they built something strange in the narrow space between silence and speech. Not romance yet. Not openly. Something more fragile and perhaps more dangerous. Familiarity. One evening, Belle found a folded blanket outside the door that had not been there before. It was heavier, warmer, and woven from finer wool than any servant was issued. She looked toward the guard post. Neither man met her eyes. From inside the chamber, Kalin's voice came low and almost reluctant. "The corridor drafts are worse at night." Belle touched the blanket, startled. "My king, I cannot." "You can. It is not mine." "I know." There was no arrogance in the statement, only tired certainty. Somewhere within the room, he shifted, and she could hear the friction of chains. Belle had known he was confined, of course. Everyone knew. Yet hearing the restraint move while he offered her warmth struck her with a force she had not expected. A king chained in his own chambers, giving away what little comfort he could. Cause and effect, she thought again. Once he had been a man whose strength made others bend. Now the only thing he could offer safely was a blanket left outside a locked door. And yet, because it was offered without demand, it carried more tenderness than grand gestures made by freer men. Bella took it. "Thank you," she said softly. Inside, he did not answer right away. Then, "You smell like frost and lavender." She almost smiled. "That seems a poor scent for a servant." "It seems clean," he said. "It is preferable to fear." After that, the exchanges changed. Not dramatically. Neither of them was foolish enough to pretend their situation was ordinary, but the pattern of care became mutual. Belle began leaving little things when she could. A sprig of dried thyme tucked into hot broth, mended cuffs returned more neatly than required. Once, when a side table had been thrown hard enough to crack one leg beyond use, she convinced a carpenter in the lower workshop to let her help repair it rather than replace it. She brought the restored piece back herself and said through the door, "It deserved a second chance." There was a long pause. Then Kalin replied, "You speak as if wood has moral worth. Everything that is broken has worth if someone is willing to mend it." She had meant the table. Both of them knew she had not meant only the table. It became easier after that to feel the current beneath their words. He asked once why she wore her sleeves so carefully buttoned even in labor. She said an old scar on her forearm drew questions she did not enjoy answering. He said no one should question scars if they had earned their own. She asked whether he had many. He gave a humorless exhale and said, "Too many to count. Some of them are not on the skin." Belle carried that sentence back with her long after the corridor emptied. Some wounds are not on the skin. That was true of her too, though no one in Ironhold had ever asked. The fortress was full of people marked by things unseen: grief, humiliation, hunger, coercion, abandonment, fear sharpened into habit. But such wounds were common enough to be ignored. Only visible injuries commanded attention, and even then, only if they affected usefulness. Perhaps that was why Belle's voice softened around Kalin when others might have hardened. Not because she excused what he had done or become. Not because she romanticized suffering, but because she recognized the shape of a person trying not to be ruled by damage already done. It is one of the dangerous truths of love that it often begins not in admiration, but in recognition. Around them, meanwhile, the machinery of power turned. Captain Rorik remained outwardly professional, but Belle noticed the small signs of protection. Routes adjusted so she was escorted more often when going west after dark. A young guard who mocked her openly was reassigned within 2 days. When an officious house steward suggested Belle could be rotated back to standard labor, now that the initial novelty has passed, Rorik's refusal was immediate and cold enough to end the discussion. He was protecting the king's stability, not Belle personally. She knew that. Yet the distinction mattered less than it once would have, because protection offered for one reason can still become real in effect. Then there was the council. Belle did not attend their meetings, but Ironhold leaked politics the way old stone leaked winter. Names traveled, fragments surfaced: Ravencrest, Lord Morn, Keldrath, Vina Hale, trade routes, border security, marriage alliances, succession pressure, stability concerns. Whenever Kalin's condition worsened, the council strengthened itself. Whenever he improved, they grew anxious in a different direction. A king fully broken was dangerous, but manageable through containment. A king recovering unpredictably was worse. Recovery could restore autonomy. Autonomy threatened all arrangements made in his weakness, and at the center of that threat now stood Belle Thain, Hogai of no title, no bloodline, no faction. That fact should have made her negligible. Instead, it made her dangerous. One afternoon, she entered the linen room to find two noble women visiting the quarter under the pretense of charitable inspection. They fell silent when she came in. One looked her over the way merchants assess cloth. "So this is her," the woman said, as if Belle were an object recently acquired. Belle kept her gaze down, though not so low as to become servile. The second woman smiled with lacquered warmth. "You have been of service to His Majesty, I hear." "I follow my assignments, my lady." A modest answer. The woman stepped closer. "Tell me, is the king calmer because you soothe him, or because he has chosen not to break you?" The cruelty of the question lay not only in its implication, but in its delight. Belle understood at once. Some people could not bear witnessing gentleness unless they were allowed to stain it. She answered carefully, "I would not presume to explain His Majesty's condition." The first woman's gaze sharpened. Wise. They left soon after, but the encounter stayed with Belle for hours. Not because it frightened her more than the West Wing did, because it reminded her that kindness, once effective, becomes threatening to those who rely on force. That was the paradox Ironhold could not yet speak plainly. Belle had not gained swords, rank, title, or command, and yet her influence had begun to exceed that of people born into authority, not because she seized power, because she altered the behavior of the person at the center of it. Kindness, under the right conditions, becomes a form of power, not the loud kind, not the celebrated kind, but perhaps the deepest kind of all, because it enters where domination cannot. Kalin understood this before she did. One night, after a difficult day during which his unrest had shaken the hall hard enough to crack a wall sconce, Belle remained longer than usual outside the door. She did not speak at first. She simply sat on the floor opposite the threshold, the fine blanket around her shoulders, listening to his breathing gradually slow. At length he said, "They will try to use you." Belle leaned her head back against the wall. "I know. Not only against me. I know that too." Something metallic shifted inside chain against ring, perhaps, or hand against restraint. "You should hate this place," Kalin said. Belle closed her eyes. "Sometimes I do. And me?" The question came so abruptly that she opened them in surprise. She thought carefully before answering. This was not a conversation to survive through politeness alone. "No," she said. "You should." "Perhaps," Belle replied. "But should and do are different things." He gave that quiet, rough exhale again. "You speak as if my crimes have not reached you." Belle stared at the torchlight, wavering across stone. "They have," she said at last. "Everyone's have." The silence after that felt sharp, but she continued before fear could stop her. "This whole citadel is built from the consequences of what powerful people choose to do. Some choices leave wounds on walls. Some leave them in people. I do not think you are innocent, my king, but I do not think you are only your worst moments either." Inside the chamber, the stillness deepened. When Kalin finally spoke, his voice had changed. Not gentler, exactly. More stripped down. "No one says such things to kings." "No," Belle said. "Usually because they wish to survive them. And you?" Belle looked at the shut door. "I wish for you to survive yourself." The words were out before she could reconsider them. For a heartbeat, the air in the corridor trembled not with aggression, but with the intensity of something profoundly felt and barely controlled. Then it eased. When Kalin answered, the rawness in his voice unsettled her more than rage would have. "That," he said, "is more dangerous than hatred." She understood why. Hatred keeps distance. To wish for someone's survival is to invest part of your own heart in whether they rise or fall. From then on, the space between them could no longer pretend to be neutral. The physicians intensified their observations. The guards became even more alert. Small privileges appeared for Belle without explanation. So did small warnings. Servants stopped speaking freely when she entered rooms. Courtiers learned her face. A clerk in the records hall asked for her family name under the pretense of updating labor rosters, though Belle had worked there long enough to know the question came from elsewhere. The world was rearranging itself around a bond still too quiet to name, and in the center of that rearrangement, Belle began to confront a truth more difficult than fear. It was one thing to soothe a wounded man. It was another to realize he mattered to her, not because he was king, not because she dreamed of elevation, not because the story of the girl who calmed the beast held any sweetness when lived from inside. He mattered because she had come to know his silences, his bitterness, the shape of his restraint, the loneliness under his command, the strange humility in the care he could safely offer. She had seen him reduced to damage and yet still trying, in broken ways, not to inflict more. And that mattered to her in a way that could no longer be dismissed as duty. Love, she would later understand, often begins exactly there. Not in certainty, but in the moment someone else's suffering stops being an abstract fact and starts altering the rhythm of your own breathing. That was the cause. The consequences had only begun. In stories told by nobles, love often arrives wearing grandeur. It appears in moonlit gardens, at banquets under gold chandeliers, in vows spoken before witnesses, in gifts chosen for spectacle rather than meaning. It is announced by music, sanctioned by titles, clothed in certainty. Nothing about Belle and Kalin began that way. Their bond grew in a place where doors stayed locked, where a king spoke from behind barriers because the force of his body still threatened harm, where a servant sat on cold stone rather than cushioned chairs, and where the most meaningful gifts were not jewels or poems, but a blanket, a repaired table, a flower tucked into a tray, a voice that stayed when fear would have left. That was how the heart learned them, through small things. Winter deepened around Ironhold. Snow gathered in the northern corners of the ramparts and remained there for days. The western corridor grew colder, despite extra braziers, because old stone always found ways to keep its chill. Belle began bringing thicker socks beneath her work skirts, and once, only once, she muttered under her breath about how the passage was colder than a punishment cell. From behind the door, Kalin said, "There are spare furs in the cedar chest to the left of the hearth." Belle stiffened. "My king, I cannot enter." "I did not say enter the chamber. There is an antechamber. The outer door can be unbarred while I am restrained." She turned toward the guards posted farther down the passage. One looked alarmed. The other looked as though he expected to be blamed whatever happened next. Captain Rorik was summoned. He arrived with the expression of a man who had long ago stopped believing in easy decisions. After a brief and tense exchange with the physician on duty, the order was given. The outer antechamber could be opened for no more than 2 minutes. The inner partition would remain shut. Belle would retrieve what she needed and step out. No one would take unnecessary risks. The lock turned. The antechamber smelled faintly of cedar smoke, old wool, and the sharper metallic edge of long confinement. Belle had never been this close before, not just to Kalin's quarters, but to the life that had narrowed around him. There was a chair against the wall, a basin stand, a low cabinet, the cedar chest he had mentioned, and signs of repair everywhere. Scratches sanded down, replaced hinges, wood darker in places where newer planks had been fitted after damage. A room constantly mended. A room like its occupant. Belle lifted out one of the folded furs, soft and heavy, and something in her chest tightened unexpectedly. A person learns much about another by what remains around them when no one expects to be seen. There was no opulence here, not anymore. Only utility, restraint, and traces of repeated struggle against a life he could not fully control. As she stepped back into the corridor, the lock sealed again. "Thank you," she said. A beat passed. Then Kalin's voice came, lower than usual. "Do not shiver outside my door." There are moments when tenderness lands so quietly it almost disguises itself as instruction. Yet Belle felt it for what it was. After that, the exchanges of care became easier, though no less dangerous. He had one of the guards leave out a proper chair in the corridor under the excuse that if Belle was expected to remain during difficult evenings, sitting on the stone would exhaust her and reduce the calming effect. The justification was practical. The result was kindness. Belle started bringing little things that asked for nothing in return. Dried wildflowers gathered from the protected courtyard beds after the groundskeeper trimmed them. Fresh bread heels still warm from the east kitchens when she knew Kalin had refused richer meals. a strip of blue cloth once, because he had mentioned absent-mindedly that the room had too much gray in it and she thought the color looked like thawing sky. He never mocked these offerings. That mattered more than she would have guessed. Some men in power despised smallness because they no longer recognized its worth. Kalin, isolated from almost everything ordinary, received each small gesture with a seriousness that turned it precious. One evening he asked, "Why blue?" Belle sat, wrapped in the fur, hands around a mug of tea she had been allowed to keep because the physicians now preferred her warm and healthy. Because winter needs reminding that it ends. Through the door came that familiar, almost laugh. "You speak to seasons as if they listen." "They do," Belle said. "They simply answer slowly, like kindness." She smiled before she could stop herself. "Yes, like kindness." It was in such moments that affection took root not in dramatic declarations, but in the accumulation of being gently understood. She learned his moods by the first word he spoke, or by whether he spoke at all. She knew when the wolf was near by the roughness in his breathing and the clipped, spare shape of his sentences. She knew when the man was more present because his questions widened, his sarcasm sharpened, and his silences felt reflective rather than dangerous. He learned her too. On evenings when her responses grew short, he asked whether the East Quarter had overworked her again. When she once arrived with a bruised wrist hidden badly beneath her sleeve, he said nothing until she was about to leave, then asked in a voice so controlled it frightened her, "Who?" "No one important," Belle replied too quickly. "That was not my question." She hesitated. A dropped crate, a careless steward, a grabbed wrist when she had not moved fast enough. None of it unusual by Ironhold standards. That was the problem. "It's handled," she said. Silence. Then, with an edge that belonged more to the king than the beast, Kalin said, "People grow accustomed to cruelty when it is common. That does not make it small." Belle stared at the torchlight. "No." The next morning, the steward in question was transferred to lower supply accounting in the freezing outer yard, stripped of hallway authority. No reason was announced. No one asked. But when the man passed Belle 2 days later, he could not meet her eyes. She should have felt satisfaction. Instead, she felt the troubling weight of consequence. Kalin had used power for her. Not publicly, not theatrically, but effectively. And in that act lay both comfort and warning. Love may begin in tenderness, but once it touches power, it can alter the lives of others in ways neither innocent nor simple. Belle understood that better with each passing week. She began to question herself more. Was she helping Kalin recover or becoming the narrow channel through which his will would one day flow? Was her presence healing him or making him dependent in ways that would wound them both? Could a man who had inspired terror learn to love without possession? Could she care for him without being drawn into the machinery of his crown? These questions did not weaken her feelings. They deepened them by forcing honesty. A shallow love seeks comfort before truth. What grew between Belle and Kalin was not shallow enough for that. One night, a storm rolled over the citadel. Wind hammered the outer towers and found its way through old cracks in the stone. The western wing flickered with unstable torchlight. The physicians had warned Belle that Kalin had been unsettled since afternoon, pacing, resisting rest, reacting badly to confinement. She came anyway, not because she was fearless, because leaving him alone now felt like abandoning part of herself. When she reached the corridor, the pressure in the air was immediate, tense, restless, almost fevered. A chair had already been knocked over outside. Something heavy struck the inner wall hard enough to make dust fall from a seam overhead. Belle set down the tray and remained where she was. Inside came a snarling sound that raised every instinct toward flight. One guard took a step forward. Rorik, present tonight, stopped him with a hand. "Wait." Belle's pulse thudded painfully. She could leave. No one had yet ordered her to stay. She had been useful long enough to know that usefulness often comes with implied sacrifice. But this was still her body, her fear, her choice. Then from inside came a sound unlike the others. Not rage. Pain. A rough, dragged breath and a blow against stone less like attack than self-directed violence. Belle swallowed hard. "Kalin?" No answer. She moved closer to the door. Look at me, Rorik snapped before catching himself, as if he had momentarily forgotten she could not. Belle placed one hand flat against the cold wood. Kalin, she said again, more steadily. It's me. The response was immediate. Not calm, not fully, but altered. The snarling cut off. The corridor pressure flared, then wavered. She kept her palm where it was. Breathe, she said, though she had no right to instruct a king and every right to sound ridiculous. Just breathe. For several terrible seconds, nothing happened. Then, through the thick barrier, she felt it. A hand, large, hot even through the wood, pressing to the other side of the same place. The contact was not real skin to skin. Yet the force of it nearly stole her breath. The corridor changed. What had been wild and edged turned, strained, then gradually, painfully, downward into something closer to control. Kalin's breathing remained harsh, but it slowed. The beast did not vanish. It yielded. Behind Belle, the guard said nothing. Rorik said nothing. Even the storm seemed to recede. She stood there far longer than she would later remember, hand to the door, as if the barrier itself had become the only safe way their two worlds could touch. At last Kalin spoke, his voice hoarse and low. Do not leave yet. Belle closed her eyes. I won't. That was the moment love crossed from possibility into truth, though neither of them named it aloud. Not because he needed her. Need can be born of fear, obsession, desperation, dependency. Need alone proves nothing, but because she stayed freely, and he asked, rather than compelled, in a world governed by dominance and command, that distinction mattered more than either title or oath. Later, after the storm passed and the corridor had quieted, Belle sat in the chair, wrapped in fur, while Kalin remained just beyond the door, silent but wakeful. Eventually, he said, I used to think strength meant never requiring softness. Belle looked at the dying torch flame. Many people do. They are wrong. Yes. Another pause. When this began, he said, I thought the worst punishment was that I could no longer control what I might do. I did not understand that the greater punishment was becoming someone no one could safely care for. The confession entered Belle like cold and warmth at once. She answered carefully. And now? Now, Kalin said. I understand that being cared for is a danger of its own. Because it can be taken away? Yes. Belle listened to the wind fading through the distant arrow slits. That is true, she said. But it is not a reason to refuse it. The silence that followed was softer than any they had shared before. At length, Kalin said, You speak as though loss is survivable. Belle thought of years in service, of hunger seasons, of people buried without ceremony, of hopes adjusted smaller and smaller until they became habits instead of dreams. It is, she said. Survivable is not the same as painless. No one else in Ironhold would have answered him that way. Nobles would have spoken in abstractions, guards in certainties, physicians in measured caution. Only Belle spoke in truths shaped by endurance. That, more than compatibility, was what reached him. Not her rarity, her honesty. From then on, the small things between them began to carry the gravity of vows they had not yet made. He asked whether she had eaten before sitting down. She asked whether he had taken the tonic the physician left untouched again. He complained once that all medicinal brews tasted like boiled roots and regret. She laughed aloud before she could stop herself, and the sound startled them both. It startled her because laughter felt so out of place there. It startled him because it was the first time he had heard her laugh freely. Again, he said. What? That sound. Belle flushed despite the cold. No. Was that a command? It was a request. Then no. His answering almost laugh was warmer this time, and the corridor, for one suspended instant, felt less like the threshold of a prison and more like the fragile beginning of a home. Two people were building out of attention alone. Yet even in such moments, cause and effect moved beneath the surface. Every act of tenderness between them made separation more dangerous. Every sign of trust made outside interference more likely. Every small thing taught the heart to want more than survival. And once the heart learns that, it cannot return unchanged. By early thaw, The first signs of spring touched Ironhold Citadel in ways so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone not trained by hardship to appreciate gradual mercy. Snow no longer crusted the eastern roofs all day. Meltwater slipped from gargoyle mouths in thin silver lines. The kitchen girls opened 2 windows instead of 1 at dawn. Somewhere in the lower courtyard, a bird tested its voice against the gray morning and found the courage to sing again. Inside the citadel, however, spring brought no easing. It sharpened things. Recovery, even partial recovery, always disturbs those who have learned to live comfortably beside another person's weakness. That was true in homes, in courts, and especially in kingdoms. While Kalin's instability had once been a source of crisis, it had also become, over 11 months, a structure around which other ambitions arranged themselves. Councils took liberties in the absence of full royal oversight. Border decisions were delayed, redirected, or quietly made by committees that should never have held such power. Trade agreements, once requiring Kalin's personal assent, were now debated by men who had begun to enjoy speaking as though the throne were an empty chair waiting to be managed. But the throne was no longer empty. Not entirely. Kalin Voss was still confined, still dangerous at times, still far from the man he had once been. Yet he was thinking more clearly, sleeping more regularly, listening, remembering, asking questions not only about weather and kitchens, but about reports, troop movement, and which counselors had lately taken to speaking as if they served the kingdom rather than themselves, and everyone knew why. Belle, not because she bewitched him, not because she had schemed for it, but because her presence gave him enough peace to remain himself for longer stretches, enough stability to resume interest, enough humanity to notice what had been done in his name, while others hoped he would never again be whole enough to object. This was the point at which her existence ceased to be merely curious. She became politically intolerable. The first direct sign came in the form of Lady Vina Hale, envoy of Keldrath Compact. Her arrival was announced with the kind of ceremony reserved for people whose power depends on appearing inevitable. She came draped in dark green velvet and diplomatic courtesy, with letters bearing seals, attendants carrying polished cases, and a smile refined enough to conceal any knife beneath it. Officially, her purpose was to strengthen commercial relations and discuss seasonal border access. Unofficially, everyone understood the real topic before she ever crossed the main gate. Marriage. Not romantic marriage, of course. Political marriage, which in great houses often resembles a treaty with jewelry. Kalin Voss, despite his condition, remained unmarried. His line remained uncertain. Ironhold's neighboring powers had every reason to prefer a queen whose loyalties could be negotiated before the king fully returned to himself. Vina Hale was not the proposed bride. She was too valuable in her own right to be spent so simply, but she carried the possibility like perfume. A niece, a cousin, a contract, a promise wrapped in silk, and almost immediately, she began asking questions about Belle. Not openly, not at first, but Belle noticed the servants around her growing nervous whenever Keldrath attendants appeared in the western passage. Then came the inquiries disguised as politeness. How long had Belle served the citadel? Did she have family? Had she ever been pledged or courted? Was it true the king tolerated only her presence now? Belle answered with studied vagueness. She had learned by then that information, once surrendered to powerful hands, rarely returned harmlessly. Lady Vina approached her directly only once. It happened in the herb room near dusk, where Belle had gone to collect dried mint and willow bark for the infirmary. She found the envoy already there, examining bundles hung from the rafters as though she had every right to inspect even the citadel's smallest stores. Belle Thain, Vina said without turning. I had hoped to meet you properly. Belle bowed lightly. My lady. Vina turned then, taking her measure in one slow glance. Her beauty was of the controlled sort, too deliberate to be called natural, too effective to be ignored. You are younger than I expected, she said. Belle did not answer. And plainer. Belle almost smiled at that, because the insult was so transparent it seemed lazy. I was not aware I was expected at all, my lady. Vina's mouth curved. Everyone of consequence is expected somewhere. The line was meant to unsettle. It did. Not because Belle feared being considered plain or lowborn. She had lived with those facts comfortably enough, but because Vina's tone made clear what Belle had already suspected. Powerful people no longer saw her as a servant. They saw her as a variable in negotiations. A word of advice, Vina continued, taking one dried stem between two gloved fingers. When the lives of rulers shift, those near them often imagine themselves more secure than they are. Belle met her gaze now, respectfully but steadily. Thank you, my lady. I imagine that is true in many courts. For the first time, Vina's smile cooled. There are moments when two women understand one another without needing plain speech. This was one of them. Vina knew Belle was not stupid. Belle knew Vina had not come to warn her for kindness's sake. It was a test. Perhaps a threat. Perhaps simply an opening move. After Vina left, Belle stood in the herb room longer than necessary, hands cold despite the dry warmth. Then she did what she had come to do increasingly often with things too heavy to carry alone. She took them to Kalin. That evening, after the corridor settled and the guards withdrew to a tactful distance, Belle told him about the encounter. He interrupted only once. She called you plain? Belle exhaled a tiny laugh. That is the part you choose to hear? Yes. Then perhaps your condition has affected your judgment. No. His voice sharpened, not with anger at her, but at something older and more protective. It has improved it. The warmth that rose in Belle then was dangerous in the way all cherished things are dangerous, because they give one more to lose. She was measuring me, Belle said more quietly. Not really my looks. My place. She cannot have it. She already knows that matters less than it once did. Silence. Then, with a force that pressed against the air even through the door, Kalin said, No one decides your place but you. Belle's throat tightened unexpectedly. That was not how Ironhold worked. It was not how kingdoms worked. Yet hearing him say it mattered because it revealed what his care for her had become. Not possession. Not merely reliance. He wanted her agency preserved. That, more than desire, is one of love's truest measures. Whether it seeks to own or to protect the other's freedom to remain themselves. Still, outside their corridor, other philosophies ruled. Lord Morn of Ravencrest Dominion arrived less than a week later. Where Vina Hale moved like silk over steel, Morn moved like iron, pretending to be patient. He was older, broad-faced, thick-handed, and bore the look of a man who believed power belonged naturally to those most willing to grasp it. Publicly, he came as council ally and wartime advisor. Privately, everyone knew he had spent the last year strengthening his influence within Ironhold's ruling body. Morn had no interest in marriage. He had interest in control. Belle never met him alone, but twice she felt his gaze on her during formal corridor transfers when the Western Passage had to be cleared for visiting lords. It was the look of a strategist identifying leverage. Soon after, the physicians informed Belle that future observations would become more structured. She would spend longer intervals near the West Wing under supervision. Her pulse would be measured before and after contact. Kalin's responses would be documented more rigorously. Diet changes might be introduced. Exposure times adjusted. The language was clinical. The meaning was not. They were turning her into an instrument. Belle listened, face still, while anger moved beneath her skin with rare clarity. There is a point at which being useful becomes indistinguishable from being handled. She had reached it. Am I being asked? She said carefully. Or informed? The chief physician shifted, perhaps surprised by the question. This is for the king's recovery. That was not my question. Captain Rorik was present in the room. He watched without intervening. At last, the physician said, Given the stakes, I believe all involved are expected to cooperate. Belle understood the answer for what it was. No, she was not being asked. That night, when she told Kalin, the corridor changed so abruptly the nearest torch flame guttered. They will not, he said. Belle had never heard that tone from him before. Not the fraying violence of the wolf, not the cold authority of a king issuing routine command. This was something deeper. Focused. Controlled fury with purpose. They already are, she said. No longer. Kalin, Belle. The way he said her name stopped her. In the months since their first conversation, he had spoken it often, but rarely with full, deliberate weight. Tonight it landed like a vow. "You are not a treatment," he said. "You are not a tool. You are not a bargaining chip for councils, physicians, or diplomats. If I must remind this fortress who still rules it, I will." Belle leaned her forehead briefly against the cool stone wall beside the door. Part of her thrilled to the protection in those words. Part of her feared them, because every time Kalin moved more decisively as king, every faction invested in his weakness would react. And the clearer his bond with her became, the more directly those reactions would center on Belle herself. That was the terrible double edge of love when joined to power. The same devotion that shields can also mark. Within days, the pressure increased. A rumor spread that Belle's compatibility might be transferable through ritual pairing. Another that she carried rare blood. Another that the wolf recognized in her some ancient bond. Most were nonsense, but nonsense serves politics well when it clouds the truth. The truth was simpler and therefore more dangerous. Belle calmed Kalin because he trusted her, and because she met his violence with neither challenge nor exploitation, but with steady, chosen presence. That truth offered no easy path for those who wished to replicate or replace her, so they tried to obscure it. A proposal emerged in council that Belle be reassigned permanently to a formal role under royal medical supervision. Another suggested she be protected in separate chambers near the West Wing, ostensibly for convenience. Both proposals amounted to the same thing: controlled access, controlled movement, controlled personhood. When Rorik quietly warned her of this, Belle's stomach turned cold. "They mean to cage me too," she said. Rorik's expression hardened. "Some do. And you? I mean to prevent stupidity where I can." It was the closest thing to personal loyalty he had ever admitted. Meanwhile, Kalin's patience thinned. One evening, after hearing fragments of council argument through a half-open records chamber earlier that day, Belle reached the corridor already tense. Before she could speak, Kalin said, "They think if they isolate you under guard, they can turn what exists between us into protocol." The fact that he already knew told her enough. Word had reached him too. "Can they?" Belle asked. He was silent long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer. Then, "Only if we let them define it." The sentence moved through her like both comfort and terror. It was the first time he had spoken of them as a joined front against something outside themselves. And because he had, there was no retreating now into the fiction that their bond was merely circumstantial. Belle sat in the chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What if they are right to be afraid?" she asked. "Of what? Of what this becomes?" Behind the door, chains shifted softly as he moved closer. "Then they should learn the difference," Kalin said, "between something dangerous and something they cannot control." Belle closed her eyes. Love had become a threat to power, not because it was dramatic, not because it had been proclaimed, but because it had altered loyalties, restored agency, disrupted manipulation, and begun to return a king to himself through means no council could command. Cause and effect. The councils had built systems around fear. Belle and Kalin had created a space shaped by trust. Those two orders could not coexist indefinitely without collision, and now collision was coming. By the time spring fully entered Ironhold Citadel, no one could honestly pretend that Belle Thain's place in the life of Kalin Voss was accidental, temporary, or politically insignificant. The physicians might still hide behind medical terms. The council might still bury intent inside procedure. Diplomats might still smile as though all negotiations were civilized. But beneath every conversation, every policy suggestion, every carefully staged courtesy, one reality pressed harder each day. Belle had become the living center of a balance no one else could maintain. And because of that, everyone wanted to decide what should be done with her. This is one of the oldest consequences in every system built on hierarchy. The moment a person once considered insignificant becomes essential, the powerful begin calling possession by softer names: protection, duty, necessity, protocol. Belle had heard all four within a single week. She moved through those days with a strange mixture of clarity and fatigue, There are seasons of life when confusion dominates, and others when the pattern becomes so obvious that pretending not to see it would be a greater burden than accepting the truth. Belle had entered the latter. The council did not care about her comfort. Keldrath did not care about her dignity. Ravencrest did not care about her feelings. Even some within Ironhold who thought themselves allies cared less about Belle herself than what she stabilized in Kalin. Only one person at the center of all this had begun, consistently, to care for both what she did and what she was. That person was the one the kingdom had spent 11 months calling monster. The irony would have been laughable if its stakes were not so high. The confrontation came not in battle, but in a council chamber. Belle was not present, but later she learned enough from Rorik, fragments from attendants, and Kalin himself to understand what had occurred. A proposal had been advanced to place Belle under formal royal watch for the preservation of His Majesty's condition and the security of the realm. She would be housed in supervised chambers, access regulated, daily contact scheduled. Her role renamed and reclassified in language meant to strip all personal meaning from it. The relationship between king and servant would be reduced to a mechanism. The argument for it was brutally rational. If Belle's presence improved the king, then the realm required guaranteed access. If multiple factions might seek influence through her, then central control was safest. If the king's judgment was emotionally compromised, then the council must intervene in the kingdom's interest. It was, in short, a beautifully crafted act of theft disguised as governance. What the council had not anticipated was Kalin arriving in person, not fully unbound, not free of escort, but walking. The chamber fell silent at the sight of him. He had not appeared before the full ruling body in many months. For some, the shock was genuine. For others, the fear was immediate. A recovering king is far harder to manage than a broken one. Kalin did not sit. He did not offer courtesy beyond what rank required. He stood at the head of the long table, pale from confinement, powerful despite the visible strain in his posture, and made it plain within minutes that he understood exactly what had been proposed. No one quoted him to Belle word for word, but when he later recounted the essence of it, his voice carried the hard, clean edge of a man who had chosen at last where he would no longer yield. "They spoke of you," he told her that night, "as if your humanity were an administrative inconvenience." Belle sat motionless in the corridor chair, every sense fixed on the room beyond the door. "And what did you say?" "That the crown of Ironhold has not yet fallen so low that it must cage kindness to preserve authority." Her breath caught. Kalin continued, quieter now. "I told them they mistake the source of my recovery. It is not exposure to your presence, as one might expose a wound to medicine. It is trust. It is choice. It is the absence of coercion. If they seize that and rename it treatment, they will destroy the very thing they pretend to protect." For a long moment, Belle could not speak, not because the words were beautiful, though they were, but because they were true in the deepest way available to them now. Love cannot survive reduction into function. The more one tries to own it, schedule it, extract from it, the more its living core begins to die. That was the truth the council could not understand because councils are trained to manage outcomes, not reverence. Yet the confrontation had consequences. Lord Morn, stung and thwarted, shifted tactics. If Belle could not be openly contained, then she could be discredited. Rumors sharpened. Some said she manipulated the king for influence. Others said she was unstable, that too much exposure to wolf dominance had altered her mind. One whispered that she intended to secure marriage and rise above her station. Another that she was already with child, a transparent falsehood, but useful precisely because scandal spreads faster than fact. Belle endured it all with the numb steadiness that comes when pain is expected from too many directions to be met individually. But Kalin did not endure it quietly. He asked to see her more. The council resisted. He insisted. This was new. Not the need itself, but the refusal to let others define its terms. So, under tightened guard and endless scrutiny, their arrangement changed. Belle was allowed into the antechamber more regularly. The inner partition remained for now, but the old pattern of a voice through a sealed door was no longer sufficient. Kalin had regained enough control that supervised proximity could be justified. The physicians called it progress. The council called it risk. Belle called it what it was, a threshold. The first time she entered the antechamber while he stood on the other side of the open partition gate, separated only by iron bars rather than wood and entire rooms, her heart beat so violently she thought everyone in the corridor must hear it. He looked different up close. Not less formidable. If anything, more. The scale of him, the contained force in his shoulders, the old scars crossing forearms and throat, the controlled stillness of a predator teaching himself not to startle the one person he most wanted near all of it struck her at once. But what affected her most were his eyes. Not because they were wild. They were not then. Because they were tired. Tired in the way of someone who has fought too long against himself, and who knows the battle is not over, but has finally glimpsed a reason to win it. For several breaths, neither of them spoke. Then Kalin said, very softly, "You are real." Belle almost laughed, almost cried. "So are you," she answered. There are moments the soul stores separately from ordinary time. This was one. Not a first kiss. Not an embrace. Not even touch. Just the unbearable relief of two people who had come to matter deeply to one another finally standing where they could fully see that the other had flesh, expression, fear, and tenderness that did not dissolve under scrutiny. Kalin lifted one hand slowly and placed it against the iron. After a heartbeat, Belle did the same from her side. The bars remained. So did the distance. And yet the truth between them had never felt less deniable. "I have wanted," he said, each word measured, "to ask forgiveness for many things I cannot undo." Belle's throat tightened. "You do not owe me confession." "Perhaps not. But I owe truth." She held his gaze. "Then speak truth." Kalin looked at her as if the act itself steadied him. "I have frightened you." "Yes." "I have endangered you." "Yes." "I have drawn you into conflict that should never have touched your life." She did not deny that either. The honesty hurt because it honored reality. He was not trying to redeem himself through pretty words. He was naming cause and effect. Then he said the thing that mattered most. "And still, you came." Belle's eyes burned. "Yes." Why? It was a question he deserved an answer to, and she had spent too many nights avoiding the plainest version of it. "Because what I saw in you was not only danger," she said, "and because every time I might have turned away, I saw how much of your suffering had become a prison for everyone around you, especially yourself. I could not save all of it. I still cannot, but I could stay." And after a while, staying stopped being duty. Kalin closed his eyes briefly, as though the words struck somewhere already tender. "When did you know?" he asked. Belle thought of the storm night, the hand against the door, the blanket, the blue cloth, the first laugh, the first time his silence had felt dear instead of dangerous. "I do not know that there was one moment," she said. "I think love came the way thaw does, quietly." Then, all at once, you realize the ice is no longer holding. He opened his eyes again. "I do not deserve what you have given." "No," Belle said gently. "Perhaps not. But love is not wages. It does not come because someone has earned perfection." The words settled between them with a gravity beyond romance. That was the heart of the law she had always believed in, now finally grown large enough to govern her own life. Actions return. Yes, pain has cost. Cruelty bears fruit. But consequence is not only punishment. It is also transformation. A person who has caused harm may still face the truth of it and choose differently. A person who has suffered may still plant tenderness and watch an entirely different harvest grow. Love, in that sense, was not the cancellation of consequence. It was the place where consequence became redemptive instead of merely destructive. Yet, redemption never arrives free. Within days of that meeting, the council escalated again. Pressure mounted to formalize a succession contingency, should Kalin relapse. Keldrath renewed marriage overtures by implying that only an external alliance could stabilize the realm if the king remained personally compromised. Ravencrest courtiers quietly courted military officers whose loyalty might matter in a crisis, and Belle faced her own decision. To remain near Kalin now was to choose a future with no safety in it. It meant scandal, scrutiny, factional hostility, and the likelihood that every weakness in the kingdom would eventually lean against the point where he loved her. It meant that his enemies would watch her, and perhaps one day target her outright. It meant that any peace they made together would need to be defended, not simply felt. This was where shallow stories would end in triumph. Real ones begin their true cost there. One evening, after another long day of political maneuvering beyond the corridor, Belle stood before the iron partition and understood that Kalin would never ask the one question because he feared making her choose under pressure. So she chose to speak first. "If I stay," she said, "it cannot be because others arrange my place." Kalin's jaw tightened once, then eased. "Agreed. If I stay, I will not become a symbol they use while pretending it is honor." "Agreed. If I stay, you do not get to turn me into the reason you neglect the kingdom." Loving someone is not permission to let others suffer in the shadows. A strange, fierce light entered his eyes. "Agreed." Belle drew one slow breath. "And if I stay, then you must keep becoming the man who knows the difference between protecting and possessing." The silence after that felt immense. Then Kalin said, with absolute clarity, "That is the only version of me I want you to have." Something inside Belle gave way, not into weakness, but into certainty. This, then, was the answer. Love was not asking her to disappear into him. It was asking both of them to become more truthful, more disciplined, more accountable, more alive. So when she placed her hand against the iron again, it was not the gesture of a servant waiting for instruction. It was the gesture of a woman choosing, in full knowledge of cost, the life her heart had already entered. "I stay," Belle said. On the other side of the bars, Kalin bowed his head not as king to subject, but as one soul receiving something sacred enough to humble him. And in that moment, the law of cause and effect completed a circle no one in Ironhold had foreseen. A man who had spread fear now faced the full consequence of his past, and chose change because love demanded truth, not indulgence. A woman who had planted kindness in darkness now received not safety, but something rarer. A bond built on recognition, agency, and hard-won trust. The councils would continue to scheme. The factions would continue to move. There would be more trials, more costs, more reckonings yet unpaid. But the center had been decided. Not by decree, not by prophecy, not by force, by two people who understood, at last, that love is never separate from consequence. It is shaped by what we sow into one another. It can become destruction if joined to control. It can become salvation if joined to truth. And so the story of Belle Thain and Kalin Voss was never simply the tale of a girl who survived the Alpha King. It was the story of what happened when a man who had become a prison met the one person who did not answer his darkness with hunger or fear, but with steady light. It was the story of a kingdom learning that softness may alter power more deeply than violence ever can. And above all, it was the story of this unchanging law. Whoever plants pain must one day face its return. Whoever plants tenderness may one day stand in the harvest of a love strong enough to remake a life.